Portal. What all do I have to say to start this video off other than just the name? Since the first game's release in 2007, Portal as a series has become a worldwide phenomenon. Not only has the game series led to hundreds of pieces of merch, but the series has had dozens of crossovers, hundreds of mods, and has integrated itself deeper into the minds of gamers than a fungal parasite. If you're one of the 12 people who's never played Portal, it's a puzzle game series about using portals to get from point A to point B. Seems simple, right? Wrong. Between the two Portal games, development took a total of at least 5 years to perfect the craft of the games, and throughout those years of development, the concept of portals was iterated alongside its testing elements in order to craft the perfect balance of intellectually stimulating puzzles with accessible and fun design. As you could guess, however, not everything that was tested in Portal made it into the final game. As a matter of fact, I can name over a dozen cut testing elements off the top of my head for Portal 2, ranging from cubes that were never used in the final game to gels that weren't tagged the power of paint. However, today's episode is not on testing elements. Folks, my name is Wolfclock, and welcome to Betafied, the show where we take a look at the unused and cut content of a game and try to figure out what it was, how it worked, and why it was removed. On today's episode, we're going to be dipping our toes into Portal with the cut personality cores of Portal 2. Before we look into the cores themselves, we have to understand the deeper context. What led to the Portal 2 team creating personality constructs that interact with the player? Portal 1 had them, but those ones were just rambling balls that would fall off of GLaDOS during her fight. So how did we get from this to this? Well, in 2008, Valve conducted the Directed Design Experiments. In November of 2007, Valve shut down its production pipeline in order to allow the company to go wild with new prototypes and ideas for new games and gameplay concepts. One of these concepts was referred to as 2 bots, 1 wrench, and was a design test to see how Valve could incorporate real-time responses from AI-driven characters relative to the player's actions. We actually have a multitude of clips from this design experiment thanks to the final hours of Portal 2, and I'll show some of them to you right now.
A laundry car. There's a laundry nearby. I don't want to alarm anyone, but I see a soda can. Look out, mate! A water sink!
This heater appears to be broken.
Anyone want to see me break this cinder block with me yet? Anyone?
So, to summarize, Valve had this new technology where AI could interact directly with the player, as opposed to acting out pre-built scenes like in Half-Life 2. Obviously, dynamic AI like this could work wonders in terms of immersion, and Valve knew this. So, where did they start? To begin our journey with the cores of Aperture, we have to look towards the first attempt at a sequel to Portal. F-Stop was a directed design experiment turned game that was developed between the end of 2007 and 2008. We're saving F-Stop for its own video, but what you need to know in relation to cores comes from the Portal 2 GTC talk creating a sequel to a game that doesn't need one. In it, Valve writer Eric Wolpaw explains a particular character from this era named Betty. Let's give the talk a listen, shall we?
GLaDOS was not going to appear except in this little cameo where we had this thing called the gyroscopic liability absolver and disk operating system, and referred to as Betty. And she would kind of roll out after Cave Johnson would describe a test and quickly rattle off some legalese stuff that would absolve Aperture of any responsibility for the danger you were about to be in. It was like in those ads for medicine where they show puppies while they're talking about the rectal bleeding it's going to cause.
So, as he said, the gyroscopic liability absolver and disk operating system, also called Betty, was a miniature core that would appear to the player to rattle off warnings about the upcoming test in order to absolve Aperture Science of any consequences to their dangerous tests. As you can see, Betty was literally a Portal 1 core welded to a lamp with wheels and a glass shield to prevent the player from snapping her picture. Betty is the only pre-Portal 2 core that was cut from the game's long development. But don't worry, because we have a lot of cores to go over past this. Let's get started with the first major post-F-Stop era of Portal 2, aptly titled the Core Hub. Portal 2's Core Hub era was the second earliest era to Portal 2. It came after the Experimental era, which implemented a lot of new gameplay elements, such as lasers and funnels, and followed the player, this time a character named Mel, through the Enrichment Center as they attempted to locate 6 different cores. My friend and fellow researcher Ossy Flawol has a video dedicated to this era, so I'd recommend you check it out. Link is in the description. In essence, following the events of Portal 1, the core seen at the end of the game would have carved out the facility into sections they called their own. The player would wake a heavily damaged GLaDOS up, who would have lost all of her memories up to this point, and would be tasked with locating all of the cores who had taken over the facility and bringing them back to the hub in order to fix GLaDOS. As the name implies, the Core Hub was an era of the game's development absolutely saturated with cores, and we are going to go through each and every last one of them, starting with the first and earliest one, the Paranoiosphere. The Paranoiosphere was the first serious attempt at a core that would interact with the player and the world. He was voiced, of course, by Richard Lord, who had provided all of the core voices, save for one, up until Stephen Merchant was brought on. Instead of having a unique model, this core was so early in the game's development that he actually uses the Curiosity Core's model from Portal 1 as a placeholder. In spite of him being the earliest core, we actually have a lot of information about the Paranoiosphere thanks to both the final hours of Portal 2 and the Portal 2 GDC post-mortem. In fact, we have a video of the Paranoiosphere in action. Let's give it a look, shall we?
I think I'll just drop right in there. Yeah, well, I guess you won't be doing that, will you? Not here, you won't. Not on my watch. You can really count on that. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, indeed. I can assure you of that.
I'd love to see someone get in here. I'd really love to see that. I am absolutely just teetering on the precipice here, lady. Put me down or I will go mental and people will get hurt. Oh, fuck me.
You monster! You're killing me!
Put me down, because I doubt very much that you are prepared for the terrible consequences of me going mental, which I swear to God is this close to occurring
As you saw, the Paranoiosphere had barricaded himself into a room using turrets, believing that he would be completely safe from any intruders, not realizing that there was an open panel right behind him. After being grabbed by the player, he would frequently berate them with a barrage of empty threats as a last resort. What I find to be the most interesting thing about the sphere, however, is how he reacted to the environment. Notice how he would call out in pain when the player would bang him across walls or drop him down a staircase. This appears to be a direct evolution of the prototyping done in 2 Bots 1 Wrench, with the NPC dynamically reacting to the environment. So this core is one that just about nobody has pointed out up until this point, likely because of just how obscure it is. We only see this core once in pre-release material, specifically in Karen Prell's animation test footage. I won't go over all of the various core designs from this video, so no Wheatley crab here, but I thought this core would be worth mentioning due to the fact that it also uses a Portal 1 core model. In one of the GLaDOS animation tests, we see her gesturing to a core on the side of the screen, who proceeds to leap around 50 feet from the ground onto GLaDOS' body, hence my name, the Jumping Core. It's impossible to know if this was a core that had any additional amount of work put into it, or if it was just a model chosen as a proof of concept for the animation test, but I want to be thorough with this list. Now then, we've gotten the earliest cores out of the way. I want to introduce you to the main guys. These upcoming cores were conceptualized when development started to get serious, and were the first cores to feature a unique model. Let's get started with the amazing Morgan Freeman core. The Morgan Freeman core is the first core to receive the new model, and is our first core that received any amount of major development. The Morgan Freeman core, named of course after the actor of the same name, was a red-eyed core who had spent the better part of the last several hundred years inside of a small room, becoming very wise about everything in said room. Once moved, however, the core would have no understanding of anything outside of the room and would be perplexed, and dare I say, flabbergasted by the sight to behold outside of his tiny room. Eventually, whilst being carried around with the player, the core would begin to rattle off various pieces of advice to the player, all related one way or another to the room that the player first found him in. According to Eric Wolpaw, the character was based off of Morgan Freeman's character from The Shawshank Redemption. Next up on our list, we have the Aquarium Core. This core came from an inside joke in the offices of Valve around an Oregon Coast aquarium advertisement involving a goldfish repeatedly yelling that it wants to go to the aquarium.
Aquarium. Aquarium. Aquarium.
We don't actually know anything more about where the player would have encountered this core, or how they would have interacted with the player, but we do have the names of their voice lines, and considering that all of the lines were taken directly from the commercial, I would bet that this core would be quite easy to piece back together. Their eye color during this development period is unknown, but it was likely a light green.
I want to go to the aquarium!
Here's a core I bet you've never heard anything about. The Quint core was a core described in the final hours of Portal 2. We are unsure of his eye color, voice, or whether or not he actually had a model or any dialogue created before the end of the era. Named after Robert Shaw's character from the movie Jaws, the Quint core would have been an AI hunter, with GLaDOS being his white whale. And now we close on one of the most important cores of the Core Hub era. Described in the final hours of Portal 2 as being a bumbling, frantic, not-so-sure-of-himself British sphere, voiced by Richard Lord, Pendleton was the first pass at the core we now know as Wheatley. Although we don't know for absolute certain what his eye color was during the Core Hub era, it's speculated to have been purple. To close out the Core Hub era section, we have two additional, unnamed cores that the player would have encountered at one point or another whilst traversing the facility. Who were these two mysterious cores? What would they have looked like? What were the personalities programmed onto them? Unfortunately, there's no solid answer to be had for any of these questions, as, in late 2009 or early 2010, the Paint team joined onto the Portal 2 project, and with the addition of Gel into Aperture Science, it became necessary to overturn the game's destroyed theme, at least for the sections where Gel was going to be used, in favor of a cleaner Aperture. This leads us directly onto our next era of development with our new set of cores. The multi-core era was an era of Portal 2's development that lasted from late 2009 or early 2010 up until a short while after E3 2010. As the name suggests, the game would have featured multiple cores for the player to encounter. However, unlike the previous era, the game was streamlined into a linear experience at this point. Chell was reintroduced as the main protagonist, GLaDOS was back at full power and remembered the player, and the number of cores the player would encounter had been cut down. The multi-core era of Portal 2 is quite similar to the final game, with the introduction up to GLaDOS being awoken seemingly being finalized at this point. However, everything past this point is essentially the Wild West. One of the things we do know about, however, is the end to this version of the game. Multi-core era would have seen GLaDOS as the main antagonist for the entirety of the game, as opposed to the antagonist switching partway through as seen in the final game. The escape sequence would have taken place near the end of the game, and the boss fight was entirely different. According to the final hours of Portal 2, the developers had tinkered with a concept where the player would be able to choose two cores that they had met to help them fight GLaDOS, similar to how Mass Effect allows a player to pick squad mates. Although for some time, the final hours of Portal 2 writes that there would have still been a total of 6 cores that the player would have met over the course of the game, the actual number we know about for this era is 4. Disregarding Wheatley, who would have actually been killed off during the wake-up sequence at the start of the game, we have 3 cores, all of them returning faces from the prior era but with updated roles. The first core we'd see make a return was the Morgan Freeman core. Following the event of Wheatley's demise, Morgan Freeman would apparently accompany the player for an amount of time, likely whilst going through GLaDOS' testing course. Although we don't know the exact locations and events that will have transpired, I liken the Morgan Freeman core's appearances to that of how Wheatley would pop in from time to time during Act 2 in the final game. Tragically, we don't know for certain if this was the case or not. What we do know, however, is what Morgan Freeman would have looked like during this era. Left over in the game's files are the textures for all the multi-core era cores. This is how Morgan Freeman would have appeared in the game during this time. I will point out that the texture is more than just a recolor of Wheatley's eyes. Well, yes, the design is the same as Wheatley's eye in the final game. However, the texture is not just a color shift. I learned this the hard way whilst trying to recreate the eye texture so that would be the same level of fidelity as Wheatley's eye. Similar to Morgan Freeman, the Aquarium core would have made an appearance as well, and also similar to Morgan Freeman, we have no definitive idea as to where the Aquarium core would have appeared. Additionally, however, we know what the Aquarium core would have looked like thanks to its texture being left over in the final game. This version of the core sported a light green eye, similar to that of seagrass. Fitting, no? As far as we know, the core still had no additional lines other than telling the player that it wanted to go to the aquarium. Now, finally, we have a core with a lot of information. Shocking as it might be, considering that this era included Wheatley at the beginning of the game, Pendleton himself also made a return, sporting these textures. Yes indeed, despite Wheatley being a direct evolution from Pendleton, both cores actually coexisted for a time in early 2010. Additionally, we have over 40 lines for Pendleton thanks to a VScript file. According to the VScript file, Pendleton would have accompanied the player after escaping from GLaDOS's testing track, possibly even being the core that would have broken Chell out. After this, Pendleton would accompany the player, stating his distaste of GLaDOS, whilst the two make their way to the neurotoxin generator. Once at the neurotoxin generator, the pair would work together to destroy it, utilizing a crane and a tube of antimatter-filled energy cores, likely the unused exploding footballs. So, recapping, the game went from 1 core, to 2 cores, to 6 cores, to 4 cores, and back down to 1 main core in the final game. So, let's talk about why. Each core in the final game, be it Wheatley or any of the corrupted cores, have a traceable lineage. To start things off, we have Betty, the gyroscopic liability absolver and disk operating system. She was just, a GLaDOS reference, so there's our earliest core out of the way. Next up, we have our friendly old paranoia sphere. What happened to this frenzied little guy? Well, here's the community's working theory on him. The core that the player would have once found barricaded inside of a room with turrets all facing the door seems quite similar to a core that has been hiding in one room for hundreds of years, only to freak out about everything outside of it. That's right, we believe that the paranoia sphere, the earliest core designed for non-F-stop Portal 2, may have evolved into the Morgan Freeman sphere. After a while, his rantings about going mental evolved into giving the player wisdom and facts about his room. Sounds familiar, yes? Indeed. It appears that this core wound up in the final game as the Fact Sphere. Next on the list, we have the friendly yet very corrupted Aquarium core. This guy lasted around 2 years of the game's development, raving about an aquarium. I am happy to say that our green little friend here also made it into the final game. I imagine most people can tell quite easily what he evolved into. But if 2 and 2 doesn't make 4 in your head, I'll let you know outright that our fish-loving friend went from loving the ocean of Earth to the ocean of dust and particles above our heads, as the Aquarium core became the Space core in the final game. Now, whatever happened to our underdeveloped fisherman friend, the Quint core? Was he simply lost to the development cycle? Well, I'm happy to say that even Quint made it into the final game. Being the only adventurous, grizzled AI hunter of our list, this core went from hunting for GLaDOS to hunting for Wheatley. In the final game, Rick, the Adventure Sphere, carries nearly the exact same personality conceptualized for Quint, making him our third fully new core to make it into the final game. Lastly, who could forget good old Pendleton, the nervous, jumpy British core turned GLaDOS hater and neurotoxin destroyer? Of course, by E3 of 2010, when Valve received enough positive feedback on Wheatley to scrap the remaining cores, the remaining portions of Pendleton were merged into our blue-eyed friend from the final game. Funny, isn't it? A Betafied where everyone makes it into the final game at the end. Just this once, everybody gets a happy ending. From paranoid to wise to an information dump. From fish-loving to space-loving. From GLaDOS hunting to Wheatley hunting. And from purple to blue, every last core of Portal 2's development made it into the final game one way or another. Well, almost everyone. Thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, a like and a comment could never hurt. And if you're interested in more videos like this, feel free to subscribe. The Portals are a rich series of games when it comes to cut content, so more videos like this are definitely on the table in the future. If you'd like to watch my other Betafieds, I have a mega playlist here. One last thing, if you'd like to try out the remade cores I've shown off in this video, downloads to mods for each of them are in the description as well. I've been Wolfclock, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next video, whenever it may be.